94.9 KUOW Seattle. It's Friday, June 8th, 2007. I'm Dave Beck. Ahead in 14 minutes, the Chicago singer-songwriter Steve Goodman penned hits like The City of New Orleans and battled leukemia for nearly half of his brief life. Ahead, Seattle journalist Clay Eals on his new Goodman biography. Friday, June 8th, 2007, KUOW 94.9. I'm Dave Beck. Steve Goodman had a knack for putting life into perspective. The Chicago singer-songwriter who penned hits like The City of New Orleans battled leukemia for nearly half of his brief life. Seattle journalist Clay Eals spent 8 years writing and researching Goodman's first comprehensive biography. It's titled Steve Goodman Facing the Music. Clay Eals joins us to share how Steve Goodman's short life and rich musical legacy inspire rare devotion among his fans and friends. Clay, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dave.
Steve Goodman actually spent his last days in Seattle. He died here in September 1984, at the end of a very long battle for him.
That's right. He was diagnosed when he was age 20. And so for his entire adult life, he had death sitting on his shoulder.
He was diagnosed with leukemia. He didn't undergo most of his treatment here. This was sort of a coda to the cancer, as you've put it.
Correct. He had most of his treatment at Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. But even at the end, Sloan Kettering decided to refer him to Seattle, where the Hutch is really has always been the world's leader in treating leukemia with bone marrow transplantation. But you have to remember, this is still the dark ages of leukemia treatment, and Goodman's veins were shot, and he was, as he put it, he says, "I'm a lucky boy." I mean, most people who were diagnosed in 1969 died within a few months or a year or so, and he stretched it out to more than 15.
Wow. You eulogized Steve Goodman in the pages of the West Seattle Herald, I believe, one of the many newspapers and publications you've worked on over the years. What was important for you to write about this man's life in that early obituary?
Well, I had his records all through the 70s, and I got to see him perform live a couple of times. He just really got me. He was the best performer I had ever seen, and I think that was the case with so many other people, but somehow he just didn't rise to be that kind of a household word that we associate with other performers. Certainly many people I interviewed in the book who had such regard for him, names that we all know much better than Goodman. And I just felt that I needed to give him his due. He died here in Seattle. That was my local angle, and I was able to do a story in the entertainment section about him.
Yeah, and your memories of hearing him play. You said you heard him down in Eugene?
Both times were in Eugene, Oregon. The first time was he was opening for Randy Newman, and Randy was touring on his Short People hit. And Goodman said, "I'm going to have to get stilts for this gig," because Goodman was only 5'2". A guy isn't supposed to be 5'2", but and people said that Randy had the ultimate short person opening for him.
And Randy Newman and so many of the great musicians and folks, over 1,000 people that you interviewed over the 8 years that you spent of your life putting this biography together, had extraordinary regard for Steve Goodman.
This is true. He was the musician's musician, and he influenced a lot of them. I mean, just take one, for example, Jimmy Buffett. People think of him as a superstar now, but there was a time when Buffett was opening for Goodman, and Buffett was the one sleeping on Goodman's couch and borrowing money from Goodman to get to the next gig. I mean, Goodman was tremendously influential, and think about, it doesn't have to be somebody who has died, but think about somebody in your own life who you parted ways with or just haven't had any connection with for 2 or 3 decades, and then some guy comes along and says, "I'm doing a book on this guy, tell me about him." And these people just poured out their memories. I mean, some of them cried when they talked to me. It was an emotional experience. Goodman just had that effect on people.
Clay Eals is with us. The Seattle journalist spent 8 years writing and researching the late singer-songwriter Steve Goodman's first comprehensive biography. The new book is called Steve Goodman Facing the Music. So he lived his life, and so many people say this, with the kind of specter of death shadowing him. And did that scare him? Did it drive him? How did it just...
Well, that's one of the things I really wanted to explore. Certainly it changed his life. He quit college when he was diagnosed and went right into music. And you got to remember, he didn't know how many months, let alone years, he was going to live. But the fascinating thing to me was, as driven as he was in his adult life and as active and energetic and engaging and inspiring as he was, this guy was driven when he was a little kid and when he was in high school. As a grade school kid, he in his temple, he was a star. He not in grade school, but in the temple, he was the boy soloist that people came to see every Saturday morning for bar mitzvahs, and he'd perform for 300 or 400 people at a time with this beautifully clear, classically trained voice. And then come high school time, he learned guitar from a couple of friends. And you would never see him without a guitar around his neck. He was playing constantly. Music really was his life all through his childhood and adulthood.
Yeah. Arlo Guthrie was another interview subject for your book on Steve Goodman. How did Steve's song, City of New Orleans, come to be such a hit for Arlo?
Oh, my. Well, Arlo took Steve's song, which was a kind of an up-tempo song, and he turned it, as Steve puts it, into the Disappearing Railroad Blues. Arlo slowed it down a bit in the studio. Arlo tells this great story about how they tried it 6 different ways in the studio, and the way that he finally made it into something that felt right was to slow it down. It still had the beat of the train, but as Goodman said, he slowed it down so that you could hear the words. And Arlo's version was really more of a lament, and it really got at the soul of the song. The song is really, it's a train song, but it's really about the passing of an era. It's about "Don't You Know Me? I'm Your Native Son." It's a very, it has a sad tinge to it, and it could be taken as to be meaning the mortality of all of us.
Yeah.
You know, it's a train, but it's also tremendously symbolic.
Just a saying, good morning, America, how are ya? Hey, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when day is done. Dealing cards with the old men in the club car.
John Denver recorded this tune as well as Steve Goodman. How did Denver work with Steve in recording this song?
Well, you know, this was before Arlo's version, and Denver did what I would call making it City of New Orleans light. He took out some of the best parts, best lyrics of the song. He told Steve, you know, I've got to change it to be more like what I wanted. He took out the Disappearing Railroad Blues. He changed Old Black Men to Old Gray Men. He added some lyrics that sounded kind of like John Denver at the time. He was looking for a follow-up hit to Take Me Home, Country Roads. And Goodman really had no choice but to go along with this because he wanted to provide a legacy for his family and didn't know how long he was going to live. Of course, he became enraged when he saw Denver's album and flipped it over to the other side, and there it said, City of New Orleans by Steve Goodman and John Denver.
Wow.
And another one who was enraged was Arlo Guthrie, who later read John Denver, The Riot Act, about this. The sort of bittersweet happy ending to this is that in 1997, John Denver recorded a CD of train songs called All Aboard, and he reverted to the Steve and Arlo version of the song. But very sadly, just about a month after that was when Denver died in the plane crash.
Right, exactly. Yeah. You mentioned the people that you talked about for this biography of Steve Goodman. Over 1,000 people. Hillary Rodham Clinton, one of them.
Well, she's no rock star, but she went to high school with Goodman. And it took me more than 6 years to finally land the interview, going through aides and donors and so forth. And she really wanted to do the interview from the beginning. And we talked last June by phone for 15 minutes. And boy, you can see why she's a presidential candidate. She has charisma in every syllable. When she's talking to you, she's talking to you. And her memories of Goodman were quite vivid from high school. They were in the same variety show together, a theme of Showboat, you know, the Broadway musical. And the most famous song from that, of course, is Old Man River. What Hillary told me that I found most interesting was that she thinks that Steve's found some of the seeds for writing City of New Orleans by singing Old Man River, because the two songs basically follow the same river's course down to the Gulf of Mexico. That's one of the joys of doing interviews is you find out things that you didn't know.
And again, these people want to talk about Steve Goodman. I mean, incredible loyalty. And
well, you take Hillary, for example. She said you just always had a smile on your face when you saw Steve coming down the hall. And she still gets a smile. Both she and Bill consider Goodman one of their favorite musicians, and they have said so in interviews with other people as well.
Yeah. We're talking with Clay Eals, the Seattle journalist, spent 8 years writing and researching the new biography of Steve Goodman, the late Chicago singer-songwriter, called Steve Goodman, Facing the Music. How was baseball such a passion in his life? Chicago Cubs meant a lot to Steve Goodman.
Well, where Steve grew up as a kid, he was in a tiny house, and right outside his backyard was a baseball field. You would literally step outside the fence to his backyard, and you were in the baseball field. He played catcher on a lot of the get-up games that they had there. And then if you were standing in the middle of this baseball diamond and you looked north across Foster Avenue, you would find a cemetery. So there you've got the dying Cub fans' last request, all encapsulated in one childhood. Right. Goodman talked a lot about the Cubs' futility. He said they never won anything in his lifetime, and his song, A Dying Cub Fan's Last Request, remains accurate to this day. He said, you could learn everything you needed to know about failure growing up in Chicago and save yourself $25,000 in psychiatric bills by being a fan of the Chicago Cubs.
Yeah. How did he come to write A Dying Cubs Fan's Last Request?
Oh, he talked many times about how he wanted to write a baseball song, and he made some attempts throughout the 70s, but then he made an analogy to him being a pitcher, and he says, I get down to the late innings, and it's getting hot out there, and my arm's starting to fail, and the manager always takes me out. But he awoke from a dream one morning in March of 1981 and had the whole song in his head, and it's really based on the St. James Infirmary blues, Bang the Drum Slowly, where somebody is planning his own funeral. And in this case, it's an old Cub fan, he said, who was planning his funeral, and he injected almost every baseball reference you can imagine into this song with a really heavy dose of what you would call gallows humor. Yeah. He was one to laugh at death. It was the way that he could face his own mortality.
Yeah. What is the version of the tune that you've brought in? When was it recorded? How did it kind of come into your hands?
Well, this version is a rare version. He had just been dropped by Asylum Records. He had been straining for commercial success, and his records were selling less and less. And right at the time he was dropped, he came up with this song, and he had to get it out somehow. He played it on the radio in Chicago, and there was so much request for it that he decided to, and this was something that was kind of unheard of at the time. Nowadays, people make their own records all the time, their own record labels, but he was a pioneer in this. He released a 45 on what he called Red Pajama Records. Red Pajama was a reference to his daughter's favorite Pete Seeger children's song. And the 45 was sold around the country, but didn't do very well at all. And now I'd be surprised if you could find more than a couple of dozen copies around the country. It took me 3 years to find one, and it was important to me to hear it so that I could describe it in the book.
Yeah. So what we're listening to has kind of the surface noise. It's the original 45.
That's true. That's true.
Do they still play the blues in Chicago when baseball season rolls around? When the snow melts away, do the Cubbies still play in their ivy-covered burial ground? When I was a boy, they were my pride and joy, but now they only bring fatigue to the home of the brave, the land of the free, and the doormat of the National League.
Clay Eals is with us talking about his new biography of Steve Goodman, the late Chicago singer-songwriter. Steve lived with leukemia for 16 years, died at the age of 36 in 1984. The book is called Steve Goodman, Facing the Music. How did he get along with Chicago Cubs front office? I mean, he was such a high-profile fan, and sort of talking about the Cubs and their losing ways. That wasn't always the message that the folks in the office there wanted to get across.
Well, Dallas Green took over the Cubs shortly after Goodman's Dying Cub Fan came out, and basically banned Goodman from playing it at Wrigley Field because it's about the lovable losers and the doormat of the National League, and the Cubs didn't want to be known as that. And ironically, that decision produced another baseball song by Goodman, because the staff who worked for Dallas Green and the staff of WGN Radio in Chicago really didn't like the fact that Goodman was banned from Wrigley Field. And so they came up to Steve, one of them did during one of his radio interviews, and during a break they said, "Steve, can you write us another Cubs song, something that we can play at Wrigley?" And he came up with Go Cubs Go, which has been the anthem for the Cubs for the past 23 years. I was just in Chicago for the book launch last month, and I experienced this firsthand. As Goodman says, every once in a while the Cubs screw up and they win. And at the moment of the end of a game in which they win, roaring over the stadium speakers is Go Cubs Go, and it's electric. You can feel the whole stadium singing to this song.
To what extent, Clay, did writing the first comprehensive biography of Steve Goodman sort of take over your life? Again, you've talked to these thousands of people, or hundreds of people, over 1,000 over the last 8 years.
Well, it's just a great journalistic challenge to do a book on somebody who has not had a book done on them. And with Goodman was such a gregarious guy that people kept referring me to other people to talk to, and there's always gold behind door number 3, and so I just felt that I had to keep going on this. Goodman is not a household word, and I knew that this possibly would be the only book on Steve Goodman, and so I felt I had a mantle on my shoulders to do the most comprehensive job I could, to get it right, in other words. And it became a monster. I mean, it's 800 pages. It weighs 4 pounds. It's got 540 photos. I actually had a guy tell me last fall, he said, most people want to write a book that you can't put down, but you've written a book that you can't pick up.
Your wife was teasing you about, she didn't know if it was a mission or an obsession, but you actually wooed your wife with a Steve Goodman song, or a song or two, I guess. Oh,
more than a few songs. Goodman was a master songcrafter. He wrote the best funny songs. He wrote really socially incisive songs, and he could really write romances. Old Fashioned is a wonderful romantic song, and so many others. But the best songs that he did in that vein were ones where he wrapped them all up into one song. And, one great example of that is this Hotel Room, where basically he's just very much describing in concrete detail everything that's in the hotel room. But then he wraps up the song by turning it into a love story, saying, I'm done with this hotel room and I'm coming back to my baby. Put a candle in the window and I'll be home. It's very kind of an unpretentious way of wooing anybody. And sure, I sent tapes to my wife, and I think they had an effect.
Clay Eals is a Seattle journalist who spent last 8 years writing and researching the late singer-songwriter Steve Goodman's first comprehensive biography. It's called Steve Goodman, Facing the Music. Clay sharing how Steve's short life and rich musical legacy inspired rare devotion among his fans and friends. Clay speaks about his book at 5 tomorrow evening, Saturday, June 9th at the Elliott Bay Book Company. Thank you so much. Great to talk to you.
Thank you, Dave.
Friday, June 8th, 2007, KUOW 94.9. I'm Dave Beck.